Good evening, everyone. Good to see so many familiar faces. I think this is the fourth year that we've had the Western PA small congregational cohort programming, and the fourth year that Eric has been with us to give one of his phenomenal presentations. I think you know that I'm with the Jewish Community Legacy Project. We work with small congregations all over the country, helping them do their legacy planning as well as sustainability planning. And we've worked with over 350 congregations all over the country. Uh, we, in the course of working one-on-one, we found that congregations that live in the same geographic area would benefit by bringing them together for the leadership to share ideas, but also for the congregants to enjoy programming that possibly one congregation can't do on its own. And so in addition to Western PA, your cohort, we have it in Central PA, New York, Ohio, Greater Mississippi, Upper Midwest, Texas, and the Carolinas. And like I said, I think this is the second cohort. I think Central PA was the first one, but both basically the same. We have on the Zoom tonight Sam Bernstein, who is the chair of the board of JCLP. He also was the last president of Temple Hadar Israel in Newcastle. And when they closed, in addition to setting up a cemetery endowment fund, they set up a legacy fund where Sam and his committee allocates funds each year for programming primarily in the Western PA area. And I'm proud to say that tonight's program is the result of a grant that was made by the Temple Hadar Israel Legacy Endowment Fund to JCLP and the Rao Jewish Archives to support the program that you are going to hear tonight. Uh, Eric, I don't think needs any introduction because most of you have been on programs before, with the exception of our Youngstown friends, and we want to welcome you for coming across the border and enjoying what Eric's going to be talking about. Eric is the executive director of the Rao Jewish Archives of the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. He is one of the finest archivists and museum curators in the country, and we are really blessed to have him tonight speak about children and youth in Western PA. Eric? And he's going to start with talking about his children for the first 20 minutes and then 10 minutes to give his presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Thanks, Noah. On that note, I'd like to start by thanking my wife, who's doing bedtime duty for both our kids tonight. Noah, thank you as always for inviting me, and thank you for convening this community and keeping it so thriving. This is one of my favorite talks every year because it's I get to see so many people that I love and that I've enjoyed getting to know over the years, and I would never get to see all of you in the same room. It just wouldn't be possible for us to all be together. So I'm really fortunate that we're able to all meet together on Zoom for this talk once a year. I also want to thank Sam, and I want to thank the community in Newcastle for supporting this program. Before I get into my remarks, I want to give an update on the Small Towns Project, which is something that I do every year when we do this talk. So just a reminder, we started this project back in 2014, and at the time, Susan Melnick, who a lot of you knew, was running the project. And the idea was to proactively collect records from congregations, small town congregations that were closing or shrinking. And in that first year, we met our friends in Newcastle and Latrobe and Uniontown and some other congregations. Sharon, I believe, was one of the ones that we met that year. Alan, that was the year that you and I met. And we really thought that was going to be a one-year project. And then we met a bunch of more people, so it turned into a two-year project. And now we're in our 12th or 13th year of it. And the first phase of the project was to collect all the records. And we've we're always collecting. We'll continue doing that forever. But we do feel that we've reached, um, we at least we think we've collected everything, or we know the collections that we don't have yet, and we're sort of ready to take them if it's deemed appropriate. We've collected 22 congregational collections, and then dozens of family collections and business collections and things like that. And we've done a lot of research and programs. Um, in 2024, we added a second phase to the project, which was to start taking these historical records back to the towns and to really work with the non-Jewish populations in those towns to give them a better understanding of their own Jewish history. And as part of that, what we're doing is we're trying to create entries on our website for all of the Jewish settlements in all 26 counties of Western Pennsylvania. And we started that work with a pilot project that was funded by the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh in Butler County. So you can see this is what the page looks like for Butler County. It includes some histories that have been written, and then it includes 19 entries on various towns or peoples or organizations from that county. So, for example, Saxonburg, today, no Jews live in Saxonburg that I know of, but it did have the first kosher hotel in the state of Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth. So this becomes a great repository for all of this information. And like I said, we're working to do that for all 26 counties, and we currently have gotten support for about half. So I just want to run through those really quickly. So Washington, Beth Israel, they recently sold their building in Washington, PA, and they, as part of that, underwrote processing for their papers and for work in Washington County. We're working with Falling Water on a project to do Jewish history in Fayette County. Our friends in Cambria, Somerset, I see Barry Rudell here, have very generously underwritten a project in those two counties. So we're working on pulling together all that material. About a year ago, on a very, very snowy day last January, Barry and I drove all over those two counties, kind of finding the last little remnants of Jewish history in a lot of the smaller towns. Obviously, Johnstown is still chugging. As part of the Federation grant this coming year, we're hoping to start work on Lawrence and Mercer County. That'll allow us to clear out a backlog that we have of wonderful materials. Alan recently sent some great stuff from Farrell, and we have a bunch of good family collections that came in recently. We have a grant from the Levin Foundation to do 5 counties in the northern part of the state. That's Clarion, Venango, Clearfield, Jefferson, and Forest counties. And as part of that, we're partnering with a lot of the historical societies in these places, trying to get some displays up. So Venango County, they recently got a grant at their historical society, and we're working with them. We're partnering with the New Bethlehem Historical Society. All these places have historical societies. And what I found is that the historical societies are almost always very excited because the Jewish story for small towns is the story of Main Street. And so a lot of these historical societies feel very positively about their Jewish history and are often have quite a sophisticated understanding of it as well. And then we're working with some folks in Crawford County who are putting together a book about their Jewish history and a display in their historical society as well. So that work will continue. Our hope is for the next 5 to 7 years, it'll take us to kind of clear out all these 26 counties. And any of you that would like to be involved in that, let me know. And for our friends in Eastern Ohio, if you ever want to talk about ways you can replicate something like this, I'm happy to partner with anyone out there. On a related note to that, the Rao Jewish Archives has recently been working behind the scenes with a cohort of maybe 24 other Jewish archives across the country to create something called the Jewish Archives Collective. And this is a very informal group that's just a way that all of the Jewish archivists, all these Jewish community archivists can meet regularly, share ideas, and partner on larger projects. And one of the things that we found is that a lot of these Jewish archives are very interested in the small town story, and they're starting to have to reckon with it, just like we've been reckoning with it here in Western Pennsylvania for a while. And so Noah and I have been in early conversations about doing a program for that group, and my hope is to advance that in the next few weeks. And then the last piece of this, just because I saw somebody from Parkway Jewish Center on, is we recently got a grant to do similar work in our suburbs. And I mention that only because in Western Pennsylvania, small towns and suburbs, it's not always so clear what's one and what's the other. Um, and so we're going to be launching that at some point in the spring or summer. We were able to get funding to do processing work on 4 or 5 suburban collections in our region. And some of those, like I said, whether it's a small town or a suburb, depends on what day of the week it is. Um, so I just wanted to share that and thank you all for all the support that you've given to this project over the years. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that online or offline. And certainly anybody who wants to be a part of this effort, there's plenty of room for help and for volunteers. Okay, so without further ado, I want to share this talk about small towns and Jewish education. And this talk comes out of some work that the RAU did over the past few years to really understand the educational landscape in Western Pennsylvania. One of the persistent challenges you find when you're looking at Jewish education is good teachers. That's really one of the biggest issues. And it's an important issue at any school, regardless, Jewish, non-Jewish. But the challenge is really much greater when it comes to Jewish schools. And that's because the knowledge is much more specialized and the pool of available applicants is generally much smaller. And the infrastructure for training teachers is much less robust than it is for the general population. You can go to any college in the country and get a teaching certificate, but to become a Jewish educator, there's just not the same resources available. In some ways, this challenge is universal, but in some ways, it's unique to America or America in the 20th century. If you go back to Europe, the Jewish communities there had a much higher baseline knowledge about Jewish text and tradition, especially coming out of that shtetl environment. In some ways, almost anybody could be a teacher. And what I mean is that people who had other job skills entered other professions where they could make a better living. And people who had a higher who were more advanced intellectually, they rose up through the ranks of this very robust religious education system in Europe. So either they became rabbis, or they became the heads of yeshivas, or they became community judges, or they became what was known as a maggid, like a traveling speaker. And what this left was a large group of educators called malamdim. And they kind of went around the shtetl looking to grab enough students that they could support themselves. If you go to the YIVO Encyclopedia, YIVO is the large Yiddish archive in New York, they said that the Melamed, quote, became a last resort for some of those who did not find a niche in the general employment system. So if you go back to Europe, you have a large group of people who are able to provide Jewish education. And as a result, everyone is able to get some level of Jewish education. But as that Jewish population migrates to the United States, the number of students is staying the same, but the number of teachers is declining. And also, you start to get a growing culture gap because you have European parents and American children. And so, this system that had developed in Europe over maybe 1,000 years was very suddenly not working as well in the United States. And this was creating a problem all over the country. And communities all over the country were developing new educational programs to try and adapt the long history of Jewish education to this new place, America. In that effort, Western Pennsylvania was often seen as the most challenging region of the country for providing Jewish education. And to explain why, we have to kind of take a snapshot. So I picked the year 1919 because we have good statistics from that year, and it's right before a lot of the solutions that we're going to talk about today were implemented. So in 1919, Pittsburgh had somewhere between 43,000 and 60,000 Jewish people. That wide range is because there was one set of statistics that was put out by the American Jewish Yearbook, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh thought that the number was too high. So let's put it somewhere around 50 or 55,000 Jewish people. The vast majority of those Jewish people lived in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. So that's a neighborhood that is immediately adjacent to downtown Pittsburgh, and it was the center of Jewish life in Pittsburgh for a period of about 40 or 50 years. It's the equivalent of the Lower East Side, but for Pittsburgh. Even though there was this one major rooted Jewish community, the actual Jewish population of Western Pennsylvania was quite dispersed. Just within the city of Pittsburgh, you had at this time in the late 1910s, in the late teens, you had the beginnings of suburban development. So Squirrel Hill was just starting to get a community, the east end of Pittsburgh, Oakland, Beechview. And then you had already had small congregations in 7 outlying neighborhoods of the city. The Strip District, Lawrenceville, Homewood, Deutschtown, Manchester, Hazelwood, and the South Side all had Jewish congregations by that point. And then on top of that, you had another 16,000 Jewish people who were living in about 40 small towns throughout the region. This is just in Western Pennsylvania. So that small town population is about a quarter to a third of the total Jewish population of Western Pennsylvania. And then if you add Eastern Ohio in, which was sort of part of this tri-state region, you get another 10,000 people living in another dozen communities. And then if you add Northern West Virginia in, you get probably another 2,000 people in about half a dozen communities. So altogether in 1919, you have probably 30,000 Jews that are living in this tri-state, in just the small towns of this tri-state region around Pittsburgh. And that's basically half or a third of the total Jewish population of the region. This vast dispersal of Jews really upends attempts to standardize Jewish education. If you have children living in 70 different communities, then you need at least 70 schools and you need at least 70 teachers. If all those people are living in one place, you can make that same educational system work with a much smaller number of schools and a much smaller number of teachers. And so by the late 1910s, Western Pennsylvania was starting to gain this reputation as being a very challenging, perhaps the most challenging environment in the United States for providing Jewish education. How do you create a sustainable system for providing Jewish education across such a vast area? How do you have the human resources to do something like that? And so the two main solutions that were attempted in Pittsburgh were really had something in common. They were both attempts to centralize certain aspects of Jewish education and to decentralize other aspects. If you wanted to put it simply, you would say that the attempt was to centralize the quantitative aspects, meaning the administrative part, and to decentralize the qualitative aspects, which was the actual curriculum of the schools. This will make a little more sense as we go on with this story. Some of the early efforts to address this wide geographic dispersion of the Jewish communities in this region dates all the way back to the 1890s, but the movement really takes off in the early 20th century. There was a panic at the time in the Jewish world about the fate of Jewish families living in small towns. They were known at the time as country Jews. That was the phrase. If you ever look up in old Jewish newspapers, you'll see they called them country Jews. And there was a general sense that these Jews who chose to live in small towns had traded away their Jewish identities for financial stability. They were living in small towns without synagogues, without schools, without kosher food. And there was a concern that these isolated families would eventually get swallowed up by the Christian milieu that they lived within. We're talking now about the first 5 years of the 20th century. One of the striking features of that era is the way that the leading religious figures of Pittsburgh, the city, saw these small towns as their responsibility. They saw the small towns as an issue that was worthy of their concern and their responsibility. Today, I would say probably only Chabad is really structurally dedicated to pursuing Jewish people wherever they live. The Reform movement still has small town congregations. Conservative movement, I think less so. The Orthodox movement, with the exception of Gemilas Chesed, has very few across the country. But back then, all three of the major movements of Judaism were regularly venturing into the small towns to work with these emerging congregations. And that was certainly happening in our region. At that time, the greatest advocate for small town Jews in Western Pennsylvania was Dr. J. Leonard Levy, who was the rabbi of Rodef Sholem congregation here in Pittsburgh. He was appointed to that position in 1901, and within a few years, he was starting to regularly travel out to the small towns. He initially started approaching the issue of small town Jewish life through B'nai B'rith. And he liked B'nai B'rith because he thought it was a useful way of building Jewish communal life without having to deal with the financial demands of building a synagogue, without the financial demands of hiring a rabbi. And you were able to sidestep some of the more controversial points of debate that were happening in these small towns. So just as an example, in Newcastle, already by this time, there was a sizable Orthodox contingent and a sizable Reform contingent. And those two contingents had meaningful points of dispute about the nature of prayer, what language was prayer going to be in, how long was prayer going to be, was there going to be music, were men and women going to sit together? And B'nai B'rith, if you focused on B'nai B'rith, you just sidestepped all those issues and you didn't have to worry about them. And so that's why he liked using B'nai B'rith. Already by the late 19th century, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which today is the Union for Reform Judaism, had started a circuit work program that would send rabbis into small towns to provide rabbinic services to the Jews that were living in these towns. The UAHC expands this program in 1904 into a new undertaking it calls the Department of Synagogue and School Extension. So if you think of like Ag Extension at Penn State University, it was the same idea, the idea of extending the synagogue and school into these small towns. Initially, this program was run out of the central office in Cincinnati, but in 1911, they decentralized the program. They divided the entire country into 41 districts, and they picked a leading rabbi in each of those districts to oversee the regional outreach effort. And of course, Dr. Levy of Road of Sholem was appointed the supervisor of District 7, which covered all of Pennsylvania west of Harrisburg. There's a notice in the Jewish Criterion, which is the local Jewish paper, from February 1912 that reveals the scope of his ambitions. This is a quotation. During the past 3 months, Rabbi Levy, as district supervisor of Western Pennsylvania for the Department of Synagogue and School Extension, has been in correspondence with 58 congregations scattered throughout Western Pennsylvania, making plans for visiting the synagogues, developing the Sabbath schools, and delivering at least one address under the auspices of each congregation. It's really remarkable. And this is, of course, before the highway system was developed, so it was a real pain to get around all these towns. Dr. Levy's actual activities fell far short of this goal. In the first year of the program, he only visited 6 of those 58 towns. It was McKees Rocks, Newcastle, DuBois, Monessen, Huntington, and Punxsutawney. But he was still among the most active of any of the district supervisors. Those 6 visits accounted for 10% of all the towns that had been visited across the entire country. The reason that he fell short of his goal is because the Union of American Hebrew Congregations had asked him to lead a $20,000 national fundraising effort to support a new religious propaganda fund. Propaganda in those years didn't have quite the sour connotation that it has today. This was a fund that was intended to make resources available for small town Jews. During this trip, Dr. Levy traveled 40,000 miles across the country, and he raised about 10 times his fundraising goal. So he raised about $200,000 for small town Jews. Around 1915, he returns to the local effort, and he does it by arranging a convention on small town Jewish education in Western Pennsylvania. And through that convention, he starts to form some of the administrative structure to establish schools, to train teachers, and to create local resources. He was working with a team of school teachers to develop a correspondence course for Jewish children throughout the region. And, quote, the Jewish people in 350 small centers are being invited to take advantage of the opportunity offered them. That was a quote from the Jewish Criterion. So by 1915, according to Dr. Levy and the Criterion, there was Jewish settlement in 350 towns in Western Pennsylvania. And each of them they were trying to reach in some way with Jewish education. By one count, more than 200 out-of-town religious school teachers attended this convention at Road of Sholem in 1915. One of the planners of the convention was Rabbi Rudolph Coffey, who was the senior rabbi of Tree of Life congregation at the time here in Pittsburgh. And afterwards he wrote, quote, the many small Jewish communities of Western Pennsylvania were made to feel that they are part of a larger unit and are in no sense isolated from the rest of Judaism. Henceforth, they will all be linked together with Pittsburgh as the district center. Each city can retain its own autonomy in religious concerns and adhere to the traditions of the old world as it sees fit. But in matters of schoolwork and education, all cities will cooperate so that the finest results may obtain. This convention, he added, could be a model for the rest of the country because, quote, what Western Pennsylvania has been able to do, other sections of the country can also accomplish. If anything, local conditions made by this if anything, local conditions made this gathering more difficult than in other parts of America. So he was hinting at what we've been talking about, that this vast dispersal of Jewish people across the region was forcing a level of innovation. And you can hear, if you analyze that quote of his, what he's saying is that part of the challenge of providing education to so many different communities is that every community has its own desire for what it wants out of Jewish education. There may be one community that leans a little bit more traditional, another that leans a little bit more liberal. Some they may have some combination of the two. And there's a gradation. It's not just one or the other. And so what they were trying to do was to create a structure that would provide resources, but would allow each of these communities to ultimately make its own decisions. The most lasting outcome of this convention from 1915 was the creation of something called the Jewish Religious School Teachers Association of Western Pennsylvania. And the reason that it was the most lasting outcome of the convention was because one of the board members was a young Jewish educator with the National Council of Jewish Women named Miriam Schoenfeld. Schoenfeld was born in Pittsburgh around 1887 and appears to have just kind of had a natural genius as an educator. She started teaching at the Columbian Council Settlement, which is the earliest forerunner of our Jewish Community Center. She started teaching there in 1899 when she was just 12 years old. And she became the supervisor of the council's Center Avenue Religious School in 1907. In those years, the National Council of Jewish Women was also starting to consider the challenges of promoting Jewish education in small communities. It had started a religious school in McKees Rocks in 1908 as sort of a pilot project. And then soon after, it started one on the north side of Pittsburgh and then in Donora. I think I saw Sharon on the call from Donora. By World War I, National Council of Jewish Women had 18 schools with more than 100 teachers and more than 1,000 students. And gradually, they were starting to develop a model. They would arrive in a new community, and immediately they would organize all of the Jewish women in that community into a Mothers Club. And the Mothers Club was assigned financial responsibility for the local Jewish school. From there, the National Council of Jewish Women would provide assistance as it was needed. Sometimes that was in the form of financial grants. Sometimes it was in the form of textbooks. There was no internet, so if you didn't have a textbook, you didn't have a school. Sometimes it was in the form of training. So if you had somebody who was willing to be a teacher but didn't know how, they would give you training. The interesting thing about the National Council of Jewish Women approach is that it was completely non-ideological. They worked with each community to determine what the curriculum would be that would be best suited for those children in that community. By early 1921, this educational program had 25 schools throughout the region, including 2 that were at local correctional facilities. We don't like to think that there were that many Jewish kids in the juvenile detention facilities that they needed a school, but the truth is that there were. By 1923, they had 32 schools with 154 teachers and 1,629 students throughout the region. And Miriam Schoenfeld's job was to travel extensively using whatever interurban rail there was at the time to visit each of these schools with some regularity. One of the features of that time period is that they would have a joint confirmation class every year at Road of Sholem around Shavuot. So everyone would come back into Pittsburgh and they would have these large confirmation classes. This sort of brings up an interesting point about the way that the method you choose to pursue these challenges really matters. I had mentioned before that Dr. Levy had started by using B'nai B'rith, and then later Council took a different approach. One of the oddities of B'nai B'rith is that Pennsylvania and Ohio are in different districts. And so when he was using B'nai B'rith, he really didn't have the capacity to reach out to Ohio. But once the National Council of Jewish Women took over, they were not limited in that way. And they were able to reach out to all of these different places. So they reached out to East Liverpool, Ohio, and they also reached out to Huntington, West Virginia, and to Weirton, West Virginia as well. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I had to get the cat out of the room. Okay. The NCJW greatly expands their program in 1923 because in that year, the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, which is the reform movement's body at that time for managing all the reform sisterhoods across the country, they decide that one of the main pieces of their platform from that year is going to be educating the unaffiliated. We think of the unaffiliated as a very modern problem. It's been a perpetual problem for more than 100 years in American Judaism. So the NFTS asks all of its member organizations to contribute to this effort. And the Road of Shalom Sisterhood decides that instead of trying to create something from scratch, they're just going to support the existing National Council of Jewish Women program. And so now NCJW has this big infusion of people and of funding. And that year in 1925, they create something called the Southwestern District of Pennsylvania Jewish Religious Schools Program. Some of you may remember in your own childhoods growing up with the Southwestern District. By that year, 1925, the program had grown to 43 schools with 325 teachers and almost 3,000 students across Western Pennsylvania, Northern West Virginia, and Eastern Ohio. Under the leadership of Miriam Schoenfeld, they had effectively solved the challenge of providing small-town Jewish education by combining centralized administration with decentralized implementation. So Pittsburgh was responsible for all of the technical details that make things so difficult, providing curriculum, training teachers, moving people physically from place to place. But the actual implementation of the education was happening at the local level, and there was a lot of discretion given to those local educators to figure out how they wanted to pursue their own schools, how they wanted to structure their own schools. Miriam Schoenfeld died in 1934 at the age of 45. She died very young. The Southwestern District continued for another 30 years after her death, but it really never quite recaptured the excellence that it had under her administration. She was succeeded by someone named Abe Cohen, who only stayed for about 3 years, and then by a man named Saul Spiro, who stayed in the position into the early 1940s. He was able to keep the program viable, but it was starting to decline. When he took over, it had dropped to 30 schools with 1,000 children and 200 teachers. And one of the things that he did was he really changed the philosophical underpinnings of the school because he worked to systematize the school with a new copyrighted curriculum in the 1940s that was created with Dr. Solomon B. Freehoff, who had just started as the rabbi of Road of Shalom congregation. So this idea of providing a set curriculum was very different than how Schoenfeld had run the program, which very much was about letting each community figure out what curriculum it wanted. In some ways, it probably had to change because the small town population was beginning to shrink after World War II, and they were having to reckon with the fact that they didn't have the same numbers they had before, and they needed to make the most of the resources that they had available. So that's the story that's starting to happen in the small towns. At the same time, there's something correspondingly happening in the city, and these two efforts are in something of a creative tension with each other. So I want us to go back in time a little bit to 1908. And in that year, Gratz College started producing surveys of the Jewish educational scene in major cities. And Pittsburgh was one of the cities that they chose. So we happen to have really detailed statistics for what the Jewish educational system in Pittsburgh looked like in 1908. And what they found was there were 17 educational programs. That's sort of a vague term, educational programs, but it includes what used to be called Sunday school, as well as Hebrew school, which was sort of the daily afternoon program. Um, it also included institutional schools. So I had talked about the Columbian Council, which was our early JCC, the Gusky Orphanage, which was a Jewish orphanage in Pittsburgh. These had schools. And there was also a small, very traditional yeshiva in the Hill District at that time. And these 17 programs had about 1,600 students with 56 teachers. Over the next decade, so this is the 1910s, Pittsburgh grows to have a whole range of Jewish schools, including at the time 4 Jewish community centers. So Pittsburgh at one time had 4 competing Jewish community centers. It's hard to believe today. And yet there was a feeling that none of these programs were really providing an adequate Jewish education. And this was something that was really starting to become a concern all over the country. The idea that there might be Jewish schools, but that the education provided at those schools actually may not have been very good. In Pittsburgh, one of the leading Orthodox rabbis at that time was Rabbi Aaron Mordechai Ashinsky. And he convenes a meeting of local Jewish leaders in 1911 to talk about the idea of forming what he called a modern Talmud Torah in Pittsburgh. The idea was to have an afternoon Jewish religious school that would combine traditional Jewish subjects with some of the emerging educational techniques that were coming up in the modern era and some sensitivity to the fact that they were living in America and not in Europe. And the idea behind it being an afternoon school, today that's not so strange to us. But at the time, it was really a big statement because by making it an afternoon school, what he was saying is that they were not going to compete with the public school system. So this was not a parochial school. It was not something that was intended to replace the secular education you were getting during the day. It was a supplementary program. Earlier in his career, Rabbi Ashinsky had had a lot of success by traveling all over the city and throughout small towns to get financial support for his initiatives. So as an example, when he started the Home for the Aged, which was our home for the indigent elderly, about a third of the donations came from small towns. But interestingly, when he tried to do the same thing with his after-school program, he really struggled to get support both from the city and from small towns. There was a sense that there was just a strong affection for the old European way of doing Jewish education, and there was a lot of fear about trying to update that system for the 20th century and to adapt it for America. After struggling for about 5 years to get support, he ultimately was able to advance the project with a $25,000 matching grant from an industrialist named Louis Aaron. For those of you who are at that little nexus of Eastern Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania, Louis Aaron was eventually his family were owners of the Homer Laughlin China Company. So for those of you who are in that East Liverpool, Newell area, and you know about that rickety bridge that you have to pay 50 cents to go across, that was the company that they owned. This really is one of the great moments in Jewish unity in the history of our region here. You have a leader of the Reform movement, one of the lay leaders of the Reform movement, who is providing the starting funding for an Orthodox rabbi to provide Jewish education that cuts across all denominational lines. The organization that they created was called the Hebrew Institute, and they dedicate their building in the Hill District of Pittsburgh in November of 1916. They hire a man named Israel Abrams to be the first director, and Abrams was what was known as a Benderly boy. These were people, there were also Benderly girls as well. These were men and women who had studied under a man named Samson Benderly in Baltimore. Samson Benderly is generally considered to be the father of Jewish education in America. He's widely understood to be the most influential figure in American Jewish education. And a lot of the things that we take for granted today were innovations that he came up with. So one of the things that he wanted to do, some of these are so simple, it's hard to imagine that they weren't already in place at the time. He wanted to standardize Jewish education, first of all, through teachers. The idea that you would have to have trained teachers, just the same way that in the public school system, you don't just let anybody into the classroom, that at some level you need to have some training. Another was textbooks. The old system was you would sit down with a Chumash or with a Talmud and you would just start learning. So his idea was, what if we took that information and we put it into textbooks? Curriculum. The old system had no curriculum. It was just you would start learning and you would gradually kind of make your way. Another was to have buildings that were actually pleasant to be in. So if you ever visit the Hebrew Institute building in Pittsburgh, which still exists, you can see it's got tons of windows. It's got light, it's got air coming through it. It's not a dingy basement somewhere. Another was egalitarianism. Um, in Europe, a lot of girls just did not get a Jewish education. And the idea was that in America, boys and girls both needed to be getting the same education, and it needed to be a good education. He really saw Jewish education as an extension of the effort to develop Jewish peoplehood. And so a big part of the curriculum was based around learning Hebrew. And you can see all of these ideas that Benderly was coming up with in the Hebrew Institute. In a 1916 article that was trying to explain what this new organization was doing, Israel Abrams described an egalitarian program that would provide education to boys and girls. It would use standardized curriculum, train teachers, and a focus on Hebrew through something that was called the natural method, which was also known as Ivrit Be'Ivrit. It was an experiential learning program where students would learn Hebrew, and then gradually classroom instruction would be taught in Hebrew. So you would have a few years just of language study, and then gradually the teacher would switch from teaching you the language to teaching in that language. They also did all sorts of things that we might call constructivist education today, where kids are doing their own teaching of themselves. So they had a children's synagogue in the Hebrew Institute, and the children ran the entire service themselves. They had a playground, they had a library, they had clubs. All of these things were brand new to Jewish education at that time. By the start of the 1920s, the Hebrew Institute had around 1,000 students and 17 teachers. So just as an example of what we were talking about, of this challenge of providing Jewish education across a wide area, in that same period of time, the Southwestern District has 154 teachers for 1,600 students. And in Pittsburgh, they're able to do 1,000 students with 17 teachers. This is the difference between having everyone live in one place and having people live all over the place. Even so, already from the beginning, the Hebrew Institute was facing obstacles. The first is that the geographic boundaries of the Jewish community were starting to change. Just as the Hebrew Institute was getting started, people were leaving the Hill District. We're talking about the early 1920s. That means the immigration laws are changing. And that means that every time somebody leaves the Hill District, there's no longer new people coming in from Europe. That issue of immigration was also starting to undermine the teacher training. The immigration was bringing over all these people who were educators from Europe. And now, with the immigration laws changing, it was cutting off the flow of those people. So the Hebrew Institute starts taking some advice from the Southwestern District, and it starts creating new branches. So as the Squirrel Hill Jewish community is growing, the Hebrew Institute opens a branch at Colfax Elementary School, which is one of the main elementary schools in the neighborhood. And then a few years later, when Beth Shalom builds its congregation nearby, they move it to Beth Shalom. They also open a branch at B'nai Israel in the east end of Pittsburgh. And then they open a branch at Tree of Life in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh. In 1922, the Hebrew Institute buys a bus, and it uses that bus to go collect kids from all over the city every single day after school, bring them to the Hebrew Institute, and then take them back to their home neighborhoods. By 1924, the Hebrew Institute was directly competing with the Southwestern District in small towns. So by 1924, the Hebrew Institute had created small town schools in Greensburg, Butler, Tarentum, Oil City, Wheeling, West Virginia, Steubenville, Ohio, just like the Southwestern District. Still, the issue was teachers. How do you get enough good teachers? And so the Hebrew Institute starts its own teacher training program. It was called the Saul Rosenblum Teacher Training School. Saul Rosenblum was an interesting figure. He was a very learned yeshiva boy from Lithuania. He came to the United States and he decided that rather than become a scholar, he would become a businessman. He went into the liquor business. He became exceptionally wealthy, and he put a lot of his money back into Jewish education. And Saul Rosenblum was one of the first people nationally to propose the idea of Jewish studies programs at American universities. At the time, it was thought to be a completely ludicrous idea, but he really believed that Jewish studies could exist um, equal to the study of any other society in humanity. A few years after they start this teacher training school, they start the Lewis Aaron Hebrew High School. So you can see them trying to build this local infrastructure where you would educate children. Most of those children would go on to just have regular lives, but some of them would remain interested and they would get moved to this high school. And then some of those would get moved on to this teacher training school. And then those would be the teachers that would serve the Jewish community. I had mentioned these trends in immigration and trends in migration. The Hebrew Institute appears to have been the first organization in the region to pick up on these emerging trends of the demographics changing. It conducted a Jewish youth population survey every 2 years between 1924 and the late 1950s. And this survey was a snapshot of where Jewish children were living in the area. Just as an aside, the way that they did these studies, it's often very expensive to do Jewish population studies. And they came up with a very clever way of doing this survey on the cheap. Every year, they would call the Pittsburgh Board of Education and they would ask them how many students across the entire district had attended school on the day before Yom Kippur. And then they would ask how many students had attended on Yom Kippur, and they would subtract the two numbers, and that was their rough estimate for how many Jewish students were in the Pittsburgh school system. It's very clever. I don't know if it's statistically accurate, but it's clever. And when you look through this data that they collected, you can actually watch year by year as the Jewish population is leaving the Hill District and starting to consolidate in Squirrel Hill. At the start of the 1920s, about 60% of the Jewish children in Pittsburgh were receiving some form of religious education. Today, the figure is about 50%, according to the last Jewish population study. This figure of 60% was seen as a point of pride in Pittsburgh and also a point of shame, because it was a point of pride because it represented the highest rate of Jewish education of any city in the country. So there was a period of time where Pittsburgh had the highest percentage of its Jewish youth population in Jewish schools. But at 60%, it also meant that there were literally thousands of Jewish children who were not receiving any religious education at all. And those numbers were the high point. From that point on, it kept going downward or up and down. Already by the early 1930s, they found that it was a little over half. So between 1920 and 1930, it had dropped from 60% to about 50%. Even so, this 50% was twice the national average. so only half the Jewish children in Pittsburgh were getting a Jewish education, and that was twice the national average. We're now into the 1930s, and finances are a major problem. The Hebrew Institute was facing an emergency situation in its finances. Its teachers went several months without being paid, and they were trying to cut all sorts of expenses just to keep the door open. They launched an emergency appeal, and in that appeal, they revealed that they had taught 9,000 students over the previous 17 years. So what you're starting to see in the 1920s and 1930s is two challenges that seem to be contradictory. One is there's not enough facilities to teach all the children that are in the school system, and at the same time, they're not teaching as many students as they should be teaching. And so this is the twin challenge that they're trying to deal with. By the early 1920s, there were 5,200 Jewish children living in the Hill District. At that time, you had 2 yeshivas, 2 afternoon cheters, 2 Sunday schools, with a combined enrollment of 1,700. So there's 3,500 children just in the Hill District that are not receiving any Jewish education. And the existing schools could only accommodate 500 of those. So there's still 3,000 students that even if they were interested, could not be accommodated. And then if you start adding in all of the small towns and all of these other areas, you realize what a big challenge this is. And so what the Jewish community does is it starts this initiative to try to reach those unaffiliated students. In late 1921, they create something called the Bureau of Jewish Education. And the idea was to create community events that would reach unaffiliated children. The first event that they did was a community Passover celebration that was held simultaneously in three parts of the city: the North Side, the Hill District, and the East End. And they claimed later that it had brought out 5,000 children on one night, and that it was the first time in Pittsburgh community history that Orthodox and Reformed children had attended the same event. I don't know if that's true or how they would even know that, but that was what they were claiming. It's hard to say whether they were actually successful in the long term of attracting the unaffiliated and making unaffiliated kind of permanently affiliated. They released a study in 1925 claiming, as I had mentioned, that Pittsburgh had the highest rate of Jewish student engagement in the country. Just to compare those to other places, Detroit had 50%, Cleveland 45%, Boston 40%, Philadelphia 39%, New York and Baltimore 30%, Chicago 21%. And yet, what you see when you look at the records of the Bureau of Jewish Education is that it is perpetually going dormant and having to be revived through the 1920s. It's revived again in the mid-1930s under the name the Jewish Education Society of Pittsburgh. At that meeting, Israel Abrams, who was the head of the Hebrew Institute, presented new statistics. There was 16 daily Hebrew schools in Pittsburgh. There were 14 weekly Sunday schools. There was a whole host of private tutors in the community. At that time, there was more than 8,700 Jewish students, but only 3,300 were enrolled in Jewish schools. That's about 40%. So you can see the numbers are starting to go down from the 20s to the 30s into the late 1930s. And the reason they said at the time was that spending was down. In 1934, the Jewish community had spent $78,000 on education. That was down from a previous high of $150,000. So this is during an era of scarcity. When you don't have the money available, they start to cut it from Jewish education. And so the idea was that they were going to create this standardized entity called the Jewish Education Society of Pittsburgh, but it never lasted past that one meeting. This is the period of time where the Southwestern District is starting to decline, and that decline is creating new opportunities. In 1940, they tried again to standardize all Jewish education in the region through something called the Central School Bureau. And the idea was to create a clearinghouse for all educational funding. So it would be almost like a federation for schools. All the funding would come to one place, and then it would be pushed out to all of these schools. And I think the hope was that if you could control the funding, you could also start to standardize the educational offerings. To make it work, Israel Abrams said that they needed to have a 20% increase in the amount of community funds that were going towards the Hebrew Institute. At that time, tuition was 80% of revenue, and only 14% was coming from community funds through the Federation, with another 6% coming from an endowment. Again, this idea stalls, and the next attempt is through something called the American Association on Jewish Education. This was a national organization in the 1940s that was trying to create a national bureau of Jewish education. In the 1950s, the United Jewish Fund creates the Council on Jewish Education to start standardizing local schools. Ultimately, this was now the fourth attempt to standardize local schools over the previous 30 years. It was unable to surmount these internal politics of the community. The head of it at the time was a man named Dr. Aaron Kessler. He leaves the program and starts something called the College of Jewish Studies. This is an attempt to do Jewish education for students between the ages of 13 and 17. So again, the issue is, what do you do after kids are starting to have their bar and bat mitzvahs? How can you keep them in the educational system? In 1969, this College of Jewish Studies merges with a portion of the Hebrew Institute to create something called the School of Advanced Jewish Studies, or SAGIS. Some of you may remember SAGIS. And the idea behind SAGIS is really to have advanced and somewhat rigorous education for Jewish students who are very invested in their Jewish education. In 1970, which is the year that I sort of said I would end this talk, the Pittsburgh Board of Education allows city high school students to get credits for SAGIS courses. And that's seen as being this big milestone where now you're sort of tapped in to the public school education system. And the hope is that you can eventually have this robust teacher training initiative. Unfortunately, we all know that in the 1980s, there was another period of contraction. You have the decline of the steel industry, you have a large outmigration of people from this region. And in that moment when Pittsburgh is starting to lose population, um, you're starting to see a contraction in the Jewish educational system. In that period, though, right as they're starting to decline, you can see them starting to revive a lot of these ideas from the early 20th century, the ideas behind centralizing administration and decentralizing implementation. So SAGIS creates something called the Jewish Teacher Resource Center, which is a centralized repository for educational materials available to religious schools, teachers all over the Jewish community. That resource center technically still exists. If you go into Road of Sholem, there on the second floor, there is a little library called the Abraham Lippman Library, or I think it's called the Abraham Lippman Library. And all of those resources are still there in that room. It's just not something that a lot of teachers outside of the of the United Religious School really use anymore. Another thing that SAGIS did was it created something called the Keruv van. So Keruv is outreach in Hebrew, caravan, Keruv van. This was a mobile education unit that would drive around to outlying Jewish communities, almost like a bookmobile, to provide Jewish educational materials. So I want to give just a brief coda to what happens after the 1970s. As the Jewish population of Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania and this whole tri-state region is starting to decline, the Federation steps in and consolidates Jewish education in the area. In the early 1990s, the Hebrew Institute, SAGIS, and Community Day School, which is our liberal Jewish day school, are merged into something called the Jewish Education Institute. In the mid 2000s, this evolves into the Agency for Jewish Learning, and the Agency for Jewish Learning closes in the mid 2010s. A piece of it goes to the JCC and a piece goes to the Federation, but it really ended this century-long effort to try to centralize and consolidate Jewish education in Western Pennsylvania. If you look back over the 20th century, what you see is a couple of trends. The first is this idea of centralizing resources. It's the idea that with Jewish education, it's too hard for all of these different entities to try to create something from the ground up. If you have one entity that is creating these resources itself, then you have a cost effectiveness. But the second is that those schools actually do have differences one to the other. And so you decentralize classroom level decision making. And then the third is this persistent challenge of reaching the unaffiliated. I think it's helpful. I think it's somewhat hopeful to understand that what we see as a very modern problem, that all these people don't want to affiliate anymore. And we remember in the past when the synagogues were full or the schools were full, it turns out actually the unaffiliated has been a perpetual problem throughout America. I just want to end on a note from something called the Self-Study on Jewish Education. This was an initiative that was undertaken in Pittsburgh in the 1950s to do a top to bottom look at Jewish education in the region. And in their final report, they asked the question, who is responsible for what kind of Jewish education in Pittsburgh? And the ultimate conclusion they came up with was that everyone is responsible for providing that education. And so I just want to end on this idea that we often think of these educational issues as being a school level problem. How do we make sure that the students in our school are being taken care of? But really, we're one big Jewish community. And that means that we're all responsible for the entirety of the Jewish educational system. And that means both the students that are in our schools, but it also means the students that are in other schools, and it means the students that are not in any schools at all. And I think the lesson of Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio and Northern West Virginia is that if you have dedicated people, you actually can create these systems that can reach the most number of people possible, while still allowing each of those schools to retain the autonomy that allows them to make the best educational decisions for their children. So I'll end there. I'm happy to take any questions anybody might have about this or about anything else small town related.
Eric, thank you for educating us about the educational system in Western PA. And If anybody has a question, you can unmute, identify yourself and your community, or you can use the icon to raise your hand. I have a question that I'd like to start off with, Eric, which is, have there been any interviews or oral histories during the course of this 100 years that you shared with us where they actually talked to the children themselves and asked them about their experiences?
Um, so before the pandemic, there was a researcher named Howard Spodek who grew up in Pittsburgh and then eventually moved to Philadelphia. And as an aside, one of his areas of expertise was this small Jewish community in India, and he would go over to India every couple years. And in his retirement, he started to think about the education that he got at the Hebrew Institute in Pittsburgh and started working on researching it was going to be a memoir that had a sort of academic angle to it. And during the pandemic, he organized a reunion of Hebrew Institute graduates. And as part of that, he had a questionnaire that was attempting to get at some of those questions, but it was from adults looking back on their childhoods. That's the closest I can think of. I don't know of anybody who's done oral histories with students. It is an interesting idea. It is an interesting idea.
Thank you. Uh,
Eric,
Questions?
hi,
Uh,
Eric.
Laurie,
Hi, Lori.
Laurie, introduce yourself and where are you from?
Hey, I'm Lori Vivio, and I am from Monessen. However, I belong to the Greensburg Temple Congregation Emmanuel Israel. And my question was, you spoke several times about standardizing Jewish education, and it seems to me that that might have worked against what they were trying to do because there were so many differences um, within the Jewish education population. Was there an advantage to standardizing the education besides maybe a cost advantage?
So this is something that it's been really hard to pick apart what they meant by that. The records are spotty and you have to kind of read between the lines. My sense is that their concern was that it was not always clear that teachers were trained to be in the classroom, that there were people who just sort of became teachers but didn't have any actual training or expertise. And so I think the standardization was to try to find some way of having quality control for teachers and for curricula, and trying to do that in a way that would have broad buy-in, that they wouldn't lose big sections of the community through resentment or alienation. But because they never actually succeeded in that standardization, it's hard to know exactly what they had in mind. There was a lot of concern about these private tutors and afternoon cheters, and that seemed to be what they were mostly going after at that time. But I will say that even the big religious schools, like Rodef Sholem and Tree of Life, always had their own big religious schools. You constantly see them worried about having good teachers. So that standardization, I think, was starting with the teachers and then maybe was going to creep a little bit into curriculum, but they never even got it off the ground. So it was always sort of a hypothetical.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
Eric,
Sam?
Sam Bernstein, Newcastle, Pennsylvania, formerly Temple Adar, Israel. Eric, you've done a wonderful job tonight taking us through 70 to 100 years. And I know you're a real mensch and such a historian. So God bless you and thank you for this presentation. My question is, although you've talked so much about history, I know you're also a very visionary thinker. And I'm wondering what you see as the greatest challenge or challenges for Jewish education along with our youth over the next, let's say, 25 to 50 years?
It's an interesting question. So the last time I was in a Jewish classroom was probably 10 or 15 years ago. I taught at Ohav Shalom in the North Hills of Pittsburgh. And one of the things I found was the issue of relevance and trying to make sure that these materials are relevant. One of the big challenges in Judaism, I find it with my own kids, is it's a lot. There's a lot of information. A lot of this information is very ancient in its teachings, and getting to a baseline level of basic Jewish knowledge takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a high degree of literacy, and it requires all sorts of like everything is predicated on something else. You need to learn a certain amount of Hebrew. You need to learn all these terminologies, and I think a lot of us, for those of us who struggled with our own Jewish educations, a big part of it was, especially if you're not going to a day school, was why am I having to come to this extra school and what am I getting out of it? And so I think for the schools that are supplementary, that are not day schools, I think the challenge is that sense of relevance and excitement, and bringing the kind of enthusiasm that adults can often bring to Judaism, finding a way to bring that to children. For the day schools, probably the biggest challenge is just money. It is just so expensive to send kids to Jewish school. And if there's some way to figure out how to mitigate that, I think there's a lot of families that are probably kind of more willing to make that leap. There's one other challenge that day schools face that I didn't really talk about here, but it's something that came up again and again throughout this research, which is for Jewish day schools, there does appear to be a trend going back into the 19th century that if the secular studies aren't as good or better than the alternative, the schools suffer. So even though the Jewish part is the reason the school exists, if the secular part can't compete, people ultimately end up pulling their kids out, which is just a kind of something you might not think about, but it does appear to be a persistent trend going back to the first Jewish day school in Pittsburgh, which was in 1860 at Road of Sholem.
Thank you. Jack Cohen, unmute yourself and.
Thank you. Here
Where
in
are you,
Cranberry,
Jack?
I'm Cranberry Township.
Okay.
Okay, with Chabad, but I also was a yeshiva child growing up, and so I understand from Chabad's what they're trying to do, but growing up it was a lot different. And I went to yeshiva as a child, and now I live in Cranberry Township. I went to the synagogue in Butler for a while, but Chabad came into Cranberry. And now we have a lot of young families, mostly are families of mixed marriages, but they're bringing their children to Chabad to learn about Judaism and teach the young children, and they're doing a really good job with that. They've got a lot of kids, I was shocked to see how many families were there, and that live out this way, that are beginning to get back perhaps to their roots, I hope, and develop a community again. Odd that we're having this discussion, because today I was asked by a council of all religious leaders in the area wanting to get together and invite the Jewish religion to be part of that, and build a community, because they're all suffering the same as we are. People going away from religion, they're too busy, whatever reasons that is, but trying to get people back to understand the importances of getting that education that's needed. And it's beginning to happen here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Catholic schools are also consolidating. So.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. Other questions, comments?
Yes,
Marcy, Marcy, why don't you unmute yourself? Tell us where you're from.
Right? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
I'm Marcy Levin, originally Newcastle, Temple Israel, which later became Hadar Israel. My question is about confirmation. My mom and my aunts, well, my mom I know was in the first confirmation class in Newcastle before there was a Reformed temple. The kind of Orthodoxy synagogue, which was founded earlier. My grandfather was one of the founders. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, Eric, what about confirmation? Was this common? I know my mom was probably confirmed in the early 1920s. And I also remember there was a woman, my Aunt Nell Feuchtwanger, who kind of ran the school. I don't even think they had a rabbi. Was that unusual, or what can you share about that?
Yeah, so my understanding of confirmation, and Rabbi Locketts might be able to shed some light on this as well, is um, the Reform movement. If you go back to before there was bat mitzvahs, the Reform movement was trying to figure out some way of providing equal Jewish education for boys and girls. And since nobody had a conception of a bat mitzvah at the time, their idea was put both the bar and bat mitzvah aside and have this new thing that would be a confirmation, and it would be a little bit later in a child's life. So it's usually, instead of 13, it was closer to like 16. It kept the kids in school a little bit longer, and it was a way of kind of sidestepping this whole bar mitzvah bat mitzvah thing. And then over time, it started to, certainly in our region, it started to develop like some popularity. So even non-reform congregations started doing it. But what you find often in the small towns, and Newcastle is actually a really good example of this, is a lot of these small towns by the early 20th century, the majority of their population leaned Orthodox. I don't know about observances, but in their affiliation, they leaned Orthodox. But there was always these large minority reform contingents. So like Greensburg, Newcastle, it took a while for there actually to be a congregation, but long before there was a congregation, there was a group of people who didn't necessarily feel comfortable in the Orthodox congregation, but they couldn't quite support their own independent thing. And a lot of times what they would do is, instead of trying to build a synagogue, they would develop these organizations that did not require their own buildings. And the two big ones in small towns were B'nai B'rith for men and National Council of Jewish Women for women. And the Feuchtwangers, did I pronounce that correctly? So they were the leaders of that community, of that reform community in Newcastle. And you see that he was running the B'nai B'rith and she was running the National Council of Jewish Women. And through those two entities, they're able to sponsor this religious school or Sunday school, whatever it is, that is distinct from whatever Tifereth Israel was doing with their kids. And then you have this same thing happening in Greensburg and in Charleroi and in all these other towns that can't support two congregations yet, all have these minority reform groups that are doing confirmation. And then in May every year or in June every year, you'd get hundreds of kids coming to Rodef Sholem to have these gigantic confirmation services that have 5 or 10 religious schools all meeting at the same time. Then eventually, by whatever year, I think it was 1927 or something, that Temple Israel was founded, then all that moves into the synagogue, and they're not doing it as much in this kind of scattered way. That's the basic history as I understand it.
Thank you. Rabbi Locketts, did you want to add anything to what Eric said?
I think he covered it well. The one thing I was going to add is that confirmation stuck around even after B'nai Mitzvah was introduced back into Reform congregations or introduced for the first time. So lots of generations of students participated in both ceremonies.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question.
Mark, where are you from?
Yes, I'm a member of Temple Bethel in Bradford, McKean County. And Eric, I have two questions for you, if I might. In your view, is there something unique about Western Pennsylvania? The issues and challenges that you described, would they not be have been prevalent all over the United States, or was there something unusual about Western Pennsylvania? That's my first question. And my second question is, how do you define Western Pennsylvania? For example, do you include McKean County in Western Pennsylvania? Where is the boundary? So those are my two questions.
Yeah. So the first question is, the underlying issues are not unique. They were present all over the country. What was unique in Western Pennsylvania is that there was a much higher concentration of these small town Jewish communities than anywhere else in the country. And so the issue was much more pronounced here than it was anywhere else in the country. And as a result, I think Western Pennsylvania was seen as being a testing ground for ideas, because if you could make something work in this place where you had 350 sites of settlement, then you could make it work in, just to take Western Pennsylvania and Northern Ohio. You might have like 50 or 60 or 70 communities in Western Pennsylvania, whereas you might have 20 in Northern Ohio. So if you could make it work here, you could definitely make it work in these other places. And the reason why Western Pennsylvania has so many more has it's some combination of the topography of the area. So, Lori was talking about Monessen. Without the river, Monessen and Charleroi would have been one Jewish community. But there's a river that separates the two. Some of it is industry. So you had all of these sites of industry in Western Pennsylvania, and they all had their own communities around it. And then some of it is the nature of American expansion. Pennsylvania is the last of the colonies, and Ohio is developed differently. It's part of the Northwest Territories. It was developed in a much more systematic way. It's much harder to make municipalities, so there's not as many of them. So Western Pennsylvania just has this odd mix of things that just makes this preponderance of cities. The second is how we define Western Pennsylvania. So I have a couple of different definitions. The one that we use at the Heinz History Center is the 26 county region. And I'm not going to be able to name all 26 off the top of my head, but McKean County is part of that. And it's basically the way you think about it is, if you look at the old Pennsylvania Canal, everything on one side of the Allegheny Mountains is on one, and everything on the other side is on the other. The only time that we've sort of stepped outside of that is recently. Noah and I were working with a congregation in Huntington, which is a teensy bit outside of our coverage area, but there was just nowhere else the records were going to go. They wanted them to come here. The other bigger thing, though, is that the state boundaries actually are not, I think all of us kind of know that they're not, the boundaries of the states don't match the reality on the ground. And Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio and Northern West Virginia have much more in common with each other than Pittsburgh and Philadelphia do. And when you drive around this area, there's a part where it all feels the same, and then there's a part where it starts to feel different. I always joke that if I'm driving west, when I start to see corn, I know I'm not in Western Pennsylvania anymore. I'm in a different part of the country. If you're driving south and you start to see coal mines or whatever it is in West Virginia, you're in a different part. And so I think Western Pennsylvania, it's really the wrong term. There's this broader, greater region that expands into these other areas that also have these small industrial towns that also have this topography. And so Zanesville may be in Ohio, but it's much more similar to like a Butler than it is to Allentown on the other side of the state.
Sarah, you get absolutely the last. Oh, I get the last question, but you get the penultimate question.
Sorry, it's quick, I think. So, hi,
Where
thank
are
you,
you,
Eric.
where are you from?
Yeah, so I am executive director of Congregation Oath Beth Shalom, or Road of Shalom and Oath Tzedek in Youngstown, Ohio. And so, first of all, this is the first time I've heard you speak. So thank you. And this happens to be something of my own personal interest, so I appreciate it. A lot of our archives, so I'm going to speak about Road of Shalom, 1867, Reformed congregation. A lot of our historical records show connection with a lot of families in Western PA over for the same reason, right? Is that it's really just one area. Throughout your research, have you found, and we don't have to go into it, but found connections that have really connected the two regions, the greater Youngstown area to the Western Pennsylvania region? Or have you found that they're much more nuclear?
It does seem like it used to be stronger, those connections. In the late teens and early 20s, when the car starts to come out and people are able to drive around a little bit more, our local newspaper used to have a section called Merchants of Pittsburgh, merchants of nearby towns buy in Pittsburgh. And it was an effort to get small town merchants to come buy from Pittsburgh wholesalers. And as part of that, they were trying to get advertising from these smaller towns. And so they would do these community profiles. And what you see is that they are doing Youngstown and Alliance and Zanesville, like all of these towns along that eastern side of Ohio. And when you look at the records of like Weirton or East Liverpool or these places, you see that it's very common for the family in Pittsburgh to expand outward in all directions. And when they go west, that means going into Ohio. So I do think that those connections used to be stronger, and that it's sort of a shame that they have faded a little bit. And one of the things I think is interesting right now is I've noticed that Youngstown is like participating in some of the efforts to rebuild Tree of Life and to like do some of that educational work. And so maybe there's a way to like, maybe that's the beginning of these communities starting to like reconnect a little bit. The last time I was in Youngstown was I went up a couple years ago to photograph the Sharon and Farrell memorial plaques that are in the synagogue. And even though when I was driving around, the town felt very familiar to me. It felt, I recognized a lot of just the feeling of the town. It felt like towns in Western Pennsylvania to me.
Thank
you, Eric. My question is a question that you're going to leave us as a teaser, because my question is, what are you going to talk about next year? So, and we look forward to it. Thank you all. We don't have a program yet planned, but we will have something later on in the year. If any of you on this Zoom have any topics that you would like to suggest for us, please let us know. This program has been recorded. We'll put it on the JCLP YouTube and send it out to all of you. And also, Eric's, if it's okay with you, Eric, your contact information, in case anybody has any questions or any archival material that you think that the RAW would want. So to all of you, and again, to Sam, to Temple Hadar Legacy Endowment Fund, that's located at the Pittsburgh Federation. Thank you for making this evening possible. And thank you all, and happy Purim and happy Passover, and we'll reconvene soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eric and Noah. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. Good to see both of you.